Hi, Professor Utzinger here. Today we're going to talk about Walt Whitman, specifically his poem Song of Myself. Before we get into Whitman, however, just on a side note, if you hear some noise in the background, I bought 6 baby chickens over the weekend, and they are in my office here with me, and they are a little noisier than I thought they might be, but it shouldn't be too distracting. What do you know about Walt Whitman? Well, hopefully you know he's an American poet, mid-19th century. And most scholars agree that Whitman is the quintessential American poet, and for a couple of reasons. Before Whitman, poets used things like blank verse, right? They wrote poetry that didn't necessarily rhyme, but one of the definitions of poetry is that it always had meter, right? It was something that you could count out the syllables, and the rhythm was predictable, fit a pattern. Whitman comes along and he really enjoys reading folks like Emerson, that we'll talk about I think in the next couple of weeks, who really talked about liberating, being innovative, new ideas. He enjoyed the Romantic poets that we've looked at thus far this semester. But he decided that in the spirit of American ingenuity that he didn't want to be constrained by conventional poetic devices, and so his poetry, for the most part, neither rhymes nor has meter. Many people would call that prose, but once we look into the sections that I had you read for today, some patterns do emerge. It certainly still looks like poetry on the page. More interesting, perhaps for most readers, is he also felt like the content of poetry should not be constrained either. Right? Before Whitman, the important poets that came before him felt like there was a certain subject matter that was worthy of poets and poetry. Idealized love, right? Mythological ideas, biblical themes. But Whitman felt like, as an American, he should be able to write about whatever was on his mind, even a single leaf or blade of grass. And you may have noticed that he is interested in grass. And certainly the collection that Song of Myself appeared in was called Leaves of Grass. If you know anything about kind of the work from Whitman, he spent his entire life writing, revising, and republishing a collection of poetry called Leaves of Grass. And different versions and different poems appear in different editions throughout his life. The version that I had you read for today, the excerpts that are in your book, are from what's called the Deathbed edition. If you're interested in the history of books, I really would encourage you. I know I send you to archives every once in a while, but that you can find some great stuff online these days. Go to the Walt Whitman archive, and you can actually look at different editions of Leaves of Grass, and flip through the pages, page by page, and see the different poems, see the different versions of this long poem, Song of Myself, that appears throughout. And one of my favorite things about doing that is you might have guessed by the reading that Whitman had a little bit of an ego. He loved to be photographed and he loved to be drawn. And you can check out over here one of the many iconic photos. So he always included a picture of himself at the very opening pages of Leaves of Grass. And it's also fun to go throughout the years and look at the different editions, and you can kind of watch Whitman age as you go. He was rather controversial when he was young because he did write about things that some people felt like not only should not be part of poetry, but shouldn't be talked about in polite society at all. Lots of his contemporaries thought that Whitman was vulgar. Some people today still think Whitman is a little bit vulgar, and especially European scholars and writers felt like Whitman was kind of a symbol of everything that was wrong with America, the vulgar American, writing and talking about things that shouldn't be written and talked about. I don't really know anybody who's ambivalent about Walt Whitman. You either get him and you love him, or you can't stand him. So hopefully you're in the get him and love him camp. If you're not, maybe over the next couple of minutes I can convince you to at least starting to appreciate some of what I think is the genius of Walt Whitman. I might share some more biographical things as we go along, but let's go ahead and jump right into the edition that I had you look at. Yours starts on page 75. You'll notice that each section, which we would call stanzas in most poems, I don't know that they necessarily work as stanzas in this poem, but that the numbers kind of skip some. You don't have the entirety of Song of Myself, but wanted to give you a good taste of what he's doing. Interestingly enough, it is quite a wonderful experience to read the entire poem from start to finish. In fact, I fell in love with Whitman because I had a copy of Song of Myself for many years and had read bits and pieces. And then one winter, we got kind of a big ice storm and couldn't drive anywhere. And I got cabin fever after about 3 or 4 days, and I just went outside, bundled up, and started walking and read a Song of Myself out loud. And I don't know if I'd call it a religious experience, but it was pretty darn close. So reading it from start to finish out loud is a marvelous experience, but it's also written in such a way that you can just dive into different sections, just enjoy a section by itself and go back and look at others. And what I'm going to do over the next couple of minutes is really kind of go in order of how it appears in your text, but just pick out some lines that I think really reveal what I think Whitman was attempting to do. Before we delve into it, though, I do want to, in case I forget, I like people to think about the concept of two I's, and I don't mean physical eyes, but the letter I, first person pronoun. Two I's emerge from this poem. The first I is what we would call the persona of the poem, right? So the fictionalized person that Walt Whitman, the poet, created to be the voice that's speaking to us from the poem. And sophisticated readers of poetry never confuse the poet with the I that's in the poem. That's always just someone that the poet made up, and it's the persona of the poem. However, when you're reading Walt Whitman and he says things like, I, Walt Whitman, it's kind of tough to make that separation. So there's this Whitman-esque persona that speaks to us, but then also you'll notice that this I changes gender, sometimes changes ethnicity, changes points of view. So there's the I persona that we would expect. And then I would also argue that when Whitman uses I, he's also speaking for all of America. And if you want to go broader than that, maybe speaking for all of humankind. So keep that in mind, because he switches back and forth between these I's without many times giving us any warning. So that might help as you go through the poem again. Let's just start at the beginning on page 75. We don't have line numbers, but the little sections are short enough. We're going to kind of jump around, but we'll start with section 1. And Whitman really gives us his thesis statement, if you will. This is what I'm going to do in this very long poem. I celebrate myself and I sing myself. Right? Now, some people who don't like Whitman feel like his ego is too big. But if you keep in mind that part of what he's trying to do is maybe speak for America, maybe you can make some of that egotism a little bit more palatable. But definitely, if you remember back to our 5 I's of romanticism, he really taps into that idea of the individual, celebrating the individual. And then pretty quickly, after that little first 3 lines, then we get part of what I think makes this quintessentially Whitman, quintessentially American. Hey, I'm going to write about whatever I want to write about. I'm not going to write about Greek mythology. I'm not going to write about biblical characters or idealized love. I'm just going to kind of get down into the nitty-gritty. He loves nature, and that's part of what he's doing here as well, although it's not just nature, right? I loaf. right? And I mean, there's a great idea right there. I'm gonna celebrate just kicking back, doing nothing. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf and at my ease, observing a sphere of summer grass. So one of the wonderful things that when people argued that Whitman really wasn't writing poetry, I think moments like this counter that argument. What poets do is they notice the world. They notice those details that the rest of us mere mortals miss, right? And so he says, I'm going to contemplate this single blade of grass and see what I can discover from that. I'm going to move on. Let's look on page 76. Jump ahead to stanza 6. And he carries on this sort of obsession with grass. And here it's rather quite wonderful because he gives us all sorts of descriptions of what he would say this grass is. A child said, "What is the grass?" And he goes down, I'm just going to skip a little bit. That line that stands alone, I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. So I mean, a really interesting way to turn how we view the world on its head in some ways. Here we have a person saying, I'm looking at this grass and what I see is the flag of my disposition. So our disposition is kind of our characteristics, our personality. And he says, hey, this grass seems to be a flag of my own disposition. This is a theme or an idea that Whitman will elaborate on and present in many different ways throughout the poem. But it's this idea that we're connected to nature in really intimate, close ways that most of us probably haven't ever really thought about too much. We'll come back to that idea. Just a couple more things. There in the middle of page 76, another line that stands apart. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. A little disturbing, but also what a wonderful image. Thinking about grass on graves and thinking of it as uncut hair. And probably have made the connection already, right? So what he's arguing is the body is part of nature, right? And when we pass away and we are buried, and then kind of that idea of that grass coming up gives it, he personifies it, uncut hair of graves, so that life and death are connected in very intricate, and I would argue beautiful ways. The end of stanza 6 there, he says, they are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there really is no death. So again, arguing that, even after living things pass away, they can serve as nutrients for other living things. And so that when he looks at that blade of grass, one of the many things he thinks about is there really is no such thing as death. And then the last line of section 6, all goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, which I think a lot of us believe that, right? Death is going to be something that none of us can quite imagine, and if you're a person of faith and you believe in an afterlife, we would agree it's different from what anyone supposed. But I think what makes Whitman is then to add that little phrase, and luckier. I'm not really sure what to do with that. Again, if you're a person of faith, you believe in the afterlife where all of our earthly sorrows and woes will pass away, we'll be reunited with God. Most of us would say, yeah, that's going to be a great experience. I just think the word choice there is interesting, that it's luckier to experience death than anything else. I'm not sure I can go all the way with Whitman on that one, but it is an interesting idea. Stanza or section number 14 on page 77, where he says, I'm sorry, I need to get a little drink here. I am enamored of growing outdoors. That idea of experiencing life in nature. Actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to read that whole stanza. I am enamored of growing outdoors. of men that live among cattle, or taste of the ocean or woods, of the builders and steers of ships, and the wielders of axes and mauls, and the drivers of horses. I can eat and sleep with them, week in, week out. What is commonest, cheapest, nearest, easiest is me. So a new theme I think that's developed here, or beginning to emerge, is one of the things that Whitman loved about America is he loved everything that he saw in America. It was an exciting time to be alive, and Whitman tried to experience as many things as he possibly could. He loved to observe working men and women. Whitman himself volunteered to be a nurse during the Civil War. His brother was a rather successful I believe general or lieutenant, I don't remember, for the Union Army. And so Whitman started going to visit him when he could, and then really got caught up in helping out the wounded men in the field and in the hospital tents. And so he spent a tremendous amount of time there. But he's always observing. What interested him were the blue-collar men and women of American life, and he fills his poem with these people. And that line there then, what is commonest, cheapest, nearest, easiest is me. Right? He's like, I'm not as interested in the highfalutin things of this world, but the things that, the people who are actually doing things, interacting with the earth, interacting with one another. Sometimes people get a little bogged down in Whitman because he does love the list. Now, fortunately, he doesn't do this throughout the entire poem, but every once in a while we encounter it. Section 15 there. Most people would argue during Whitman's time, and maybe even now, that beginning almost every line for a stanza that spans 2 pages with the word "the" is not a great way. But if you think about it, he says, hey, I'm going to give you a list of all the things that I see in America. The pure contralto sings, the carpenter, the married and unmarried children, the pilot, the mate, the duck shooter, the deacons, the spinning girl, right? It's sort of kind of a relentless list of everything that he loves about America. Heard a scholar once describe this poem in a way that I found really fascinating. The railroad is beginning to push ever westward during Whitman's lifetime, and he loved this idea of being able to see the whole wide expanse of the North American continent. And the scholar argued that reading this poem is kind of like being on a train and starting on the East Coast, right? Because Whitman comes from Manhattan, and traveling all the way to the Pacific Ocean on a train, and imagining the poet sitting in the train looking out the window, and the images that he gives us move quickly from one to another because he's viewing America from a moving train. I don't know if that works for you or not, but I thought it was an interesting way to view this poem, and I think about it every time I read section 15 because it does move so quickly from person to person to person. Let's look at the end of section 15 on the top of page 80. And these tend inward to me, and I tend outward to them. And such as it is to be, of these more or less I am, and of these one and all I weave the song of myself. Don't ever lose sight of this poem, within this poem, the fact that Whitman is celebrating the individual, and he's also celebrating all the individuals that he sees. He's celebrating humans, he's celebrating nature, but his main overriding idea is that they're all interconnected, right? And of these one and all, I weave the song of myself. Same sort of ideas then in section 16. He begins to identify different regions of America, and it's doing some of the same things that he did in section 15. Just want to mention quickly a couple of lines. Look in section 16. Section 17. The first line. These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. They are not original with me. I might argue that Whitman is being a little bit coy here. because what he is doing in this poem may not seem new to us, but keep in mind that in Whitman's day, nobody had seen poetry like this before. And so it is wildly innovative, it is wildly individualistic, and Whitman prided himself on those things. But this persona that he creates within the poem, I don't think he's necessarily saying, hey, I'm not thinking any original thoughts or doing anything original with poetry. But what he's kind of hinting at here is in terms of the unity of the human spirit, maybe it's more of a wish than a fact. That this idea that we're all interconnected, it's not original to my thought. This is the way that humankind always has been, that we all share this interconnectedness. Now again, in Whitman's time, that idea is sort of a fantasy, and in our time, that idea is a bit of a fantasy. But Whitman lapses into some utopian thought every once in a while, and I think it's one of the nice things about the poem. This is a positive, life-affirming poem, which we don't always see in literature, so at least I hope you enjoyed that part of it. He does the same thing in the first stanza of section 19. This is the meal equally set. This is the meat for natural hunger. It is for the wicked just as same as the righteous. I make appointments with all. I will not have a single person slighted or left away. The kept woman, sponger, thief are hereby invited. The heavy-lipped slave is invited. The Veronese is invited. There shall be no difference between them and the rest. So keep in mind, I'm not wild about his phrasing, but he does mention a slave in section 19. And think about in the mid-19th century America for a white poet to say, hey, there's no difference between the slave and anyone else. Now, obviously, he's not talking about their physical condition in terms of being enslaved. He certainly would argue that there is a huge difference between being enslaved and being free. But in terms of what makes them human, Whitman's saying, look, people, there's no difference at all between any of us, which would have been a really radical idea to present in the mid-19th century for most of his audience. Let's move on, move a little bit quicker. Let's look on section 21, which is on page 83. This is a really important thing to look at. Second stanza, actually it's so wonderful, I'm going to read the first two stanzas. I am the poet of the body, and I'm the poet of the soul, right? For him, everything's connected. He would have liked the idea of Blake, right? That there's the body and the soul aren't separate, but they're one. The pleasures of heaven are with me, and the pains of hell are with me. Sounding a lot like Blake, isn't he? The first I graft and increase upon myself. The latter I translate into a new tongue. And then here's the part I really want you to think about. I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man. And I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man. Now, a lot of folks have argued that Walt Whitman was gay. And during Whitman's lifetime, he did not live as an openly gay man, which would have been a difficult thing to do in the 19th century America. But he never makes any explicit statements that he's gay. A lot of folks look to his poetry for evidence. And there are some things that we can certainly categorize as homoerotic. And a lot of scholars these days have kind of all agree that he probably was gay. He was never married in his lifetime, didn't have any children that we know of, but there's no conclusive evidence. But one thing I want you to think about is that right here in the poem he declares, this persona that I've created, I'm not just speaking from a male perspective, I am also speaking from a female perspective. So when you read parts of this poem that seem to suggest the persona is in love with men, it might be the I part of Whitman, but it might also be the part of the poem where he is speaking as a female, because he says here, that's what I'm going to attempt to do. Let's move on to another section here. Section number 24, one of the more famous parts of the poem. Early on in this discussion, I said, hey, sophisticated readers, we don't confuse the poet with the persona. And Whitman in section 24 on page 85 says, Walt Whitman, a cosmos of Manhattan, the sun, turbulent, fleshy, sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding. No sentimentalist, no stander above men and women apart from them, no more modest than immodest. It's kind of difficult not to conflate Walt Whitman the poet with the I of this poem in places, and he specifically invites us to read the poem that way when he puts his name in the poem itself. Not a common thing for a poet to do. He's proud of being a son of Manhattan, and then also what he celebrates is everything about life, right? He calls himself fleshy in other parts of the poem. He enjoys eating and drinking, everything there is about life. I am going to skip a little bit down to some of the end. I think we've covered most of the themes. Do want to look at section 32. I think it's kind of a curious, interesting part of the poem. He's taken us to all different parts of America. He showed us different occupations and different connections in life. And so why not bring in the animals? On page 90, section 32, I think I could turn and live with animals. They are so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. Not one is dissatisfied. Not one is demented with the mania of owning things. And goes on for a couple more lines. Now we can take him at face value and say, hey, as part of my imagining the interconnectivity of all human life, why not imagine what it would be like to be an animal? But you probably have figured out that in that section, I think what he's also doing is listening to things that he doesn't like about the human condition, right? That animals in some ways seem to be free of a lot of the neuroses, you might say, that human beings are burdened with. I do want to talk about God. Walt Whitman believed in God, absolutely. Was he conventional Christian? Absolutely not, right? So some people kind of get offended by some of his notions of God. He was certainly more Unitarian than anything. Let's see. I'm skipping over some things, but let's go and look at section number 48 on page 94, since we're talking about God. I really want to skip down on page 94 in section 48 to that middle stanza. And I say to mankind, be not curious about God, for I who am curious about each am not curious about God. No array of terms can say how much I am at peace about God and about death. I hear and behold God in every object, yet understand God not in the least, nor do I understand who there can be more wonderful than myself. Why should I wish to see God better than this day? Now again, some people then and now would find that idea offensive when he says, why would I contemplate God? I don't know anything more wonderful than myself. But I think the really powerful part of that whole phrase is when he says, why should I wish to see God better than this day? So for Whitman, the idea of being fully alive, right, being integrated and interwoven, that God isn't something that's set apart to contemplate, that if you're contemplating nature, then you are contemplating God. If you believe in the divine spark and you're in touch with who you are as a human being, then you are in touch with God. Again, this isn't a theology class, so I'm not arguing for Whitman's point of view in terms of spiritual matters, but I think it's pretty interesting how he presents his idea of spirituality and God. Let us move to the very end. And the end of your sections is indeed how this poem ends. Let's start looking at one thing I want to talk about in section 51 on page 96. Right there in the middle he says, do I contradict myself? Very well then. I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. So there are things within this poem, like content-wise, point of view, all these things going on. And he says, hey, if I said something here, and then it seems like I'm contradicting myself somewhere else in the poem, so be it. I contradict myself, which is, again, being a little coy, but also underscoring that theme when he says, I am large, I contain multitudes. This poem isn't just about Walt Whitman, Cosmos, son of Manhattan, right? It is about the entire expansive universe. Does he pull it off in this poem? I don't know. That's up to you as a reader. But I think it's a really intriguing thing to set out to try to do with a poem. I'm going to capture the entire universe in this one poem. And then section 52, as I mentioned there on page 97, this is how Song of Myself ends. Some of the most famous lines are pulled and quoted from this one. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. You can spend a lifetime reading this poem and you might not be able to figure out everything that I'm trying to say. I sound my barbaric yop over the roofs of the world. Right, this voice of the poem is a barbaric yop, and that's Whitman's own phrase. There was a literary journal once upon a time that was called the Barbaric Yop. And then I think some of the more lovely parts of this stanza, where it begins, I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. He pulls us back to those opening stanzas about how grass is really worthy of contemplation, and that kind of cycle of life idea. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. Right? So if you want to experience the spirit of this poem, when you're outside and you're walking around, Walt Whitman's spirit is in the grass. And if you dig Whitman, you'll love that idea every time you walk outside barefooted, although he says boot soles. And then, missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you.